started, the most important thing is to hear some of the work. So, Sheila is going to start with a short reading of Peter, and then we'll have our discussion.
Well, let me just say thank you so much, all of you, for coming. And thank you also to the Center for Fiction for doing this and for all the wonderful work that they do. All these reading groups and so many events that bring out the readers, which is really wonderful. And also thank you to both Peter and Dawn for doing this with me tonight. I'm so grateful to both of them. Dawn I've known for a long time, actually since she and I were both in a class which was given by Gordon Lish. And Dawn was the star. She was the star. And it must have been difficult for her at times, I think. Because Gordon was given, let us admit, he was given to excess. So you were either wonderful, 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 or you were basically, excuse the word, you were shit. And he would say that very clearly. But in Dawn's case, I think he was right, and I think she is a wonderful writer. And Peter, I hope he doesn't mind me saying, was one of my students. And from the moment I heard his work, I knew this was a writer. And actually, one of the chapters in his memoir, if my memory is not mistaken, I actually heard the wonderful chapter where he follows the teacher back home and stands in the rain in front of the blue door. Yes, so many echoes of colors and blues, and I'm sure we'll talk about all of that. So just to say thank you for all these readers for being here tonight, and I'll just read it's 5, maybe 6 minutes towards the beginning of my memoir. It's called Together. We're born in South Africa and grew up together in an L-shaped Herbert Baker house called Crossways in Dunkeld, a suburb of Johannesburg. Pale jacarandas line the long alley that leads up to our creeper-covered house. The thick walls and closed shutters keep the rooms cool in the hot afternoons. The vast property with its swimming pool and fish ponds, a tennis court, a 9-hole golf course, an orchard and vegetable garden, and acres of wild veldt stretches out to the blue hills. An army of servants keeps up the estate. Servants roll the butter between wooden slats with serrated surfaces, and it forms small balls that are placed in shell-shaped silver dishes. They polish the silver, the furniture, the floors. They cook the roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, the 2 green vegetables, and the roast potatoes. They simmer the inferior boys' meat, boys being how we refer to our adult male servants, into a delicious-smelling stew. They stand in their thin white gloves, their soft, silent sand shoes, and starched suits, a bright sash going slantwise across their chests. As they move behind the Chippendale chairs to serve dinner, they go out into the back patio to stoke this cold fire. Sometimes gangs of convicts are brought in to dig and smooth out the lawns with heavy rollers, to weed the flower beds planted with bright cannas, foxgloves and nasturtiums. My sister and I stand holding hands, staring at the men in their striped shirts, their bare feet, digging with the evening light behind them. We listen as they sing in sad harmony before we're told not to stare, to move along, girls. We're always together in the pale green nursery where we sleep with our nanny, the blackboard along one wall, and along the other side the 3 beds, each with its green bedspread, a wooden bedside cupboard, and a round enamel chamber pot. We're together in the sun-filled breakfast room where we swallow the thick porridge, the boiled mutton with caper sauce, the Marmite sandwiches with hot milk tea, the heavy English food that makes us sweat. We're together in the corridor with the cries of London lining the wall, a series of prints showing 19th century city vendors calling out their wares, and in the shadowy pantry with the pull-out bins for flour and cornmeal and the big bags of oranges that perfume the air. We're together in the sunshine in our identical smock dresses, our sandals, our fair bare heads. We have identical Airedales, Dale and Tony, two big dogs with the same soft, fluffy, light brown fur, who are not allowed into the house, but who roll around with us on the lawn and sleep in their kennels outside in the garden. Together, my sister and I explore the vast garden. We're left to roam in the sunshine, often barefoot, free to dream. We know all the flowers and trees intimately, like the familiar characters in a favorite book. They're part of our games, our imagination. They're half real, half made up, part of our fantasies and our reality, our transitional objects. We smash mulberries on our faces for war paint and play cowboys and Indians. We climb the jacaranda trees. They're all good, except for the last one on the left, which is wicked, and we avoid assiduously. We set up a pulley between our respective trees and send it back and forth with little notes written to one another, though I cannot yet read or write properly, and we can call out to one another much more easily. We make up our secret language, a complicated system of spelling backwards. Cat is tack, though there are few words I can spell, and I keep forgetting the rules. We give our identical dolls swimming lessons, tying string around their rubber waists and dragging them up and down the pool, instructing them to kick. We lie on the concrete around the pool in the sunshine and play the game of touching tongues, giggling. A bee stings me while we're doing this, and our nanny tells us this is what happens to naughty girls. I sit in front with my sister behind me, her legs around my waist, using our hands as paddles, sailing around the big enamel bath with its claws for feet, visiting foreign countries, going overseas, traveling around and around, splashing the water on the black and white tile floor. We whisper together in the shadows in the back of the nanny's square green Chevrolet. Let's make a bunch, I say, and together we slip off the seat and crouch down and strain, producing a small, malodorous gift for the nanny. We run down to the bottom of the garden, terrified at our wickedness. We climb the stile and hide down in the wild part of the garden, listening to the wind in the swaying bamboo. We play the secret game of doll. Alternately, Maxine is the doll, lying stiff and obedient to my wishes, or the mistress, who makes me do whatever she wants me to do. It's this game I think of later, when the Roman men call out to us, "Che bambola," what a doll, and much later still, when I see my sister, her shattered body wrapped in white, as in swaddling clothes. Thank you.
Can I borrow your accent to read my book?
No, you have yours.
Just to give a little context, my book, I was trying for years to write about two men. One was my father, and one was sort of an alternative father figure who was my 8th grade English teacher. My father was an Italian. My father and mother were both Italian, and he came here in the 30s. He was a brilliant man who went to Harvard School for Engineering and didn't bother finishing because he was offered so many jobs. Anyway, the struggle to write the book sort of resolved itself after both men died. When my father died, I learned at his funeral for the first time from a complete stranger that he was Jewish, and from two prominent Jewish families, and this had all been hidden from me. And I still didn't know how I would resolve writing about both of these people until I read that the teacher had died, and I discovered that he had fabricated his entire past. And then I realized that the theme was about these two men and why they chose to invent or reinvent themselves. My father was an inventor. He had about 50 patents. That's what he did. And then I realized as I worked on the thing that we're all inventors. You know, we all invent ourselves to various degrees on purpose or incidentally because we have these narratives that tell us who we are, we think. So we're all living a certain amount of myth. And so I call the book The Inventors. The scene I'm going to read is, I often think if I could go back in time to any experience, I would visit my father in the laboratory where he worked. And so I'm going to read a little bit about that. He had bought a house in Connecticut where I grew up, and he bought it with this notion. He loved the red barns of America. He loved the red barns. He had a fascination, and his dream was to convert a red barn into his laboratory. So he found a house in Connecticut with a dilapidated red barn. And, I forgot to thank I'm so ungracious, but you did it for both of us, you know. And thank you for having me, and I'm so thrilled to be, you know, reading with you. But anyway, so he had this barn converted, and this is going to be a description of visiting my father at the building. You loved to visit your father in the building. You couldn't wait to jump off the bus after school and run down the long dirt driveway under the drooping branches of the weeping willow trees lining it. You would enter through the main door and, provided there were no snakes living there, cross the vestibule and knock softly on the inner door. To your father's, "Is that you, Peter, my boy? Come in, come in." You would enter, forgetting to shut the inner door behind you. "Close the door," your father would say, and you'd close it. The building had 5 rooms, including the empty vestibule that was home to occasional serpents, the bathroom with a toilet that didn't work, the study where your papa kept his shelves of books, and a trundle bed that he'd sleep in sometimes after especially bad fights with your mother. Then there was the main room, where he did his inventing. It held a drill press, a table-mounted sander, a grinding wheel, the bending machine, 2 lathes, both big as mules. Here was the long bench where your papa soldered and tested his circuits, and the table where he sketched out his designs and typed on his typewriter. Thumbtacked to the wall above the tool bins was a crude sketch your papa had done of a man laid out on an operating table with surgeons cleaning up in the background, a cutaway view of his belly revealing a wrench left inside it. The caption in your father's handwriting said, "No operation is complete until all the tools and parts have been put away." Then there was the back room where your father kept the bandsaw and a blue machine on splayed legs for cutting tubes and shafts that galumphed like a lame camel. Sheets and chunks of every sort of metal were kept there in wooden bins, with other bins holding spare and used parts. Under banks of long fluorescent bulbs buzzing and wavering in their death throes, you would walk to where your father stood working, wearing his pilled, moth-eaten cardigan and stained khaki trousers in winter or shorts in summer, past rows of tiny drawers brimming with screws, bolts, nuts, washers, tubes, lenses, photocells, toggle switches, relays, tick-tick things, you called them. Solenoids, potentiometers, rheostats, transformers, resistors, capacitors, capacitators, and rectifiers. You would make your way carefully, avoiding the rotting holes in the floor. On the table next to your father's typewriter, a portable radio played a mixture of classical music and static. The building had its own special smell, a blend of solder smoke, scorched metal, mildew, electrical shorts, farts, and orange peels. Your father liked to eat oranges when he worked. He kept a straw basket of them by his typewriter. He would toss the peels into a gray metal wastepaper basket, along with gobs of pulp that he would spit into his palm. A perfume of oranges rose from the wastebasket. You would watch him typing with 2 fingers on his royal typewriter, or soldering a circuit, or turning a part on the lathe. The lathe was your favorite. You loved watching him manipulate its plethora of bright chrome dials with one hand, like an engineer manning the controls of a locomotive, while smoothing the fingers of his other hand around the spinning chuck, its knuckles black with grime. From the spinning chuck, bright turnings of aluminum, copper, and brass spiraled to the rotten floor. Afterward, you would sweep the turnings up in a dustbin and pocket the longest and brightest specimens for a collection you kept in a wooden box behind your bed. Among boxy instruments on his workbench was one with a round screen called an oscilloscope. As it shed its green light over his thin gray hair, his sloping forehead, his wrinkled brow, his aquiline nose, your father would gaze at the glowing screen, and you would gaze at him, wondering what he made of it, amazed that your father or anyone could extract meaning from a dancing thread of light. The building was your father's sanctuary, the place where he sought refuge among his ideas and his instruments. It was your refuge too, a shrine, the place where you went to worship your papa and experience the awe and mystery of his works. Under its buzzing and flickering fluorescent lights, between the holes in its rotting floor, in a pall of solder smoke and radio static, the universe was conceived, engineered, tested, and approved.
I'm thrilled to be able to talk to both of you about memoir. I've admired your writing for a long time. So, am I on? Is this, can you hear me? I will try to, thanks. Okay, so Sheila and Peter, you are both extremely accomplished writers of fiction. I've always believed that when you are writing well and honestly, no matter what form you're writing in, there's nowhere to hide. Your obsessions come out somehow. So what made you decide this time to write memoir? Why do it?
Well, yes. After my sister, who was killed in, let us say, mysterious circumstances when she was very young, after a history of battering with her husband, who was a heart surgeon, actually, this in Johannesburg, South Africa. When she died, she was 39 and had 6 children. And I tried immediately to write the story down, and I was filled with rage and guilt and all sorts of other emotions at the time. And I sat down and wrote a novel in 3 months, and I sent it off to a publisher, and it was promptly turned down. And so I called her up. I had the gall to call her up, and she had the kindness to answer my call. And I said, "Why did you turn my book down?" And she said, "It wasn't good enough." And she said, "Look, how could it have been? How long have you been writing for? How long did it take you?" And I said, "Well, yes, 3 months." Yeah, maybe, yeah. In other words, I hadn't really been able to digest this very traumatic event. I hadn't taken the time to think how to reach a reader with what I was feeling. I was interested in putting down what I felt, which was not necessarily very interesting to a reader. So that kind of process of always going through the reader sort of occurred. And initially, when I tried to write about this, I had to take a huge distance from it. And my first efforts to write this story were from the point of view of a woman who could hardly remember what had happened. She couldn't remember. "Oh, I don't remember," she kept saying. This was a first novel called The Perfect Place. But anyway, little by little, I got closer and closer to this material, which was hot material in many, many ways. And this is now more than 35 years ago that my sister was killed. And I felt finally, at some point, there was a desire from without, let's say. People I had noticed in all my writing life kept asking me, what is true here? What is the truth behind these fictions that I had written? And I've written many novels, and it was the kind of question that's rather annoying, really, frankly. You say, well, why don't they just read what I put down on a page? Why don't they know what was true, what was behind it? But I did see that this was what people were asking for. They wanted to know that this was the truth. So that was kind of an urge from without. And then from within came this inner urge that had always been there to tell this story. And that I'd been telling over and over again in so many different, and Dawn's right about this when she says that we express everything in whatever form we take. But at this point, both my mother, who had been against any kind of, as she said, think of the children. There were 6 children who were left. She said, think of the children. They have enough, their mother was killed and their father, quite frankly, was very badly damaged too. It was probably a kind of murder-suicide. Anyway, he was very badly damaged, and my mother did not want any scandal. No scandal. We're not going to say, I wanted to prosecute. I wanted to get a lawyer. I wanted to go to the law. And she said no. And she was, she'd lost one of her 2 daughters. And I felt for her in her grief. And so nothing was said. For all those years, I wrote about it as directly as I could. Finally, at this point, my mother is no more, and my brother-in-law, even more so, is no more. So there was no fear of that kind of reprisal. And he was a violent man. So that kind of danger was gone too. And finally I felt, come on, we have to, as women, tell the truth. It's time to stand up and just say what happened, the way I think it happened. Now, what actually happened, anybody could have a different story perhaps, but this is the way I saw it, and I wanted finally to put it down on the page. And so I did, and this is a long story.
So in a way it took 35 years.
It's taken all this time for me really to get this distance from this.
I mean,
what about you?
Same kind of thing. I, from very early on, almost from the beginning when I knew that I had an interest in writing, which was, in my late teens, early 20s, when I was an art student and thought, I wasn't getting any depth out of my paintings and stuff. But I always had a sort of autobiographical impulse. I always had an impulse, and partly it was based on being extremely self-conscious and self-aware. And I said, well, I can either conquer this self-consciousness, this self-awareness, or make something good out of it. Maybe I can use this to some advantage as an artist. The fact that I was so, self-aware and so, I don't know what the right word, narcissistic isn't exactly right, because it was not sort of, oh, I'm wonderful. It was more like, oh, I'm so conscious of everything all the time. And I kept a lot of journals and stuff. But in a similar way, to get it right, to go from that impulse to creating something that worked as a piece of art, that had a shape to it, and that had a level of objectivity and distance in order to give it shape, took me 35 years. I mean, I tried to tell those stories of those 2 men in various forms, even as plays, and this and that, all that time. And meanwhile, there were short stories and other novels popping out. But that was the story. I wanted to tell the story about that teacher. It was my first great love, and my first great influence. And I knew that I couldn't tell his story without telling my father's story. But again, finding the distance and then finding also the theme, the metaphor. The inventor theme came very late, and they both had to die for me to discover that. But then gaining the distance. And that's one of the reasons I wrote in the second person. When I started writing in the second person as the middle-aged or the older narrator writing to the younger self, I found it very liberating. I found that I could force that sense of distance, and then people, including myself, tried to talk me out of it, or now undo it, because no one will publish a book in the second person. When I started writing the book, no one had ever written a book in the second person that I know of, book length, and editors said, that's suicide, no one will. But when I unwrote it, I put it back into first person, which it's not that easy. And then I said, I don't like this very much anymore, and I put it back again. It's a lot of,
And
so anyway.
Yes,
yeah.
may I ask Dawn why she turned to memoir? Because you have written fiction. And,
I have, but I really had almost the opposite impulse. I had no thought at all about writing memoir. I literally was seized with the idea one day to write some things down for my children, because they're my children and they're not listening to me. And I figured one day they might want to know these things and I might not be around to tell them. In my family, the way people die is like this. They go of cardiac arrest. And I think that's really affected the way I live. And I thought, I'm going to just write these things down before I forget them myself, because I already can't remember what my father's voice sounded like. Things like that where they're gone to me already. And so I really wrote that book in my own happy little bubble. I usually need to die 10,000 deaths over every sentence, but I didn't. And it didn't hit me until I finished writing this thing that this was a book. I still wasn't even sure it was a book. I had to ask my agent if it was a book, which is something you should never do, your agent. So I honestly had the other experience, except that I certainly had been living the stories contained in these objects all my life. And what this brings me to is that everybody alive has a narrative or a set of narratives that we walk around with in our heads all day long. It's stories that mean, that affect you the most deeply. The story of the teacher, the story of the father, the story of your sister. You've probably told that story to yourself in your head or to some imagined listener 10,000 times. To write a memoir, you have to grapple with memories they're amorphous, they're shape-shifting, they're not very reliable. If you could ask a sibling or someone else who was there, they would say, no, it didn't happen that way.
And in fact, my twin brother, I should say, has the afterword in my book, and that's exactly what he does say.
Yeah. So, and you also talk about having to find a structure, having to impose a format, having to write it in a way that's interesting to other people. So in the course of doing this, you're handling these memoirs. Did that act of composition, where you have to take these memories and make them sit still, did that actually change your perception of what happened? Did it alter your own inner narrative as you were writing it?
I think my short answer to that would be no. And the reason is because by the time, and I talk about this in the book, I talk about how memory works. By the time one gets, into a few drafts anyway of a book about experiences, one has told oneself those stories. And once you tell yourself stories, and even worse, once you've written them down, they take on a solidity that's very hard to undo. That's pretty much it. And so that's how it's happened. Then you refine and you shape and you find the patterns and you work on the book in other ways. But as far as what you remember, once you write it down, even once, and even before then, memory starts to sort of gel and it takes on a life of its own. Now it can be completely wrong from the very beginning. And in fact, my brother who writes the afterword, he supports that. And there's a scene in the book, he gets the last word. Well, that's all right. That I wrote, and it's the first scene in the book where a strange woman, as I mentioned, comes up to me at my father's funeral and says, as I'm putting things away, did you know your father was Jewish? It's complete news to me, and I said, no, who are you? And anyway, my friend read the book, a dear friend, old friend, and he said, that scene, he said, you got that scene exactly perfect. I said, oh, thank you. He said, except for one thing. I said, what? He said, I'm standing next to you. So I left him out of the scene because he didn't do anything. He wasn't involved. But as far as I'm concerned, my memory told me he wasn't there. And that's not true. It doesn't really change anything, but memory is very tricky.
Yes, no, I think absolutely. Peter's absolutely right about the fact that once something is written down, it's lost in a way, because the actual memory is gone. Yeah. You've written it down, and what you've written takes the place of your actual memory.
That's right.
And so if you have done a lot of writing on the same subject, which really everything I've ever written has been about my sister's death. And I've written about her in so many different ways. Even the historical novels that I've written have been very often about sisters. I did the Brontes, which each one of those sisters was, in a way, took my sister's place. So I kept writing about this event in all sorts of different ways. So in a way, it was already transformed into words, these images, and my memories come to me very often in images, and I don't know how you remember things, all of you, but for me it's sort of pictures in my mind. These had been turned into words already, so I don't think that this had actually changed the way I felt about this. And people ask me this all the time. Did the fact that you finally wrote down a memoir, did that give you closure?
Yeah, closure.
Do you feel that now it's over?
No.
And I say no. And in fact, my next book, which I have written at this point, or at least I hope I've written it, it's with my editor, is another way to give a woman a voice who doesn't have a voice. And that is, I've written Sonia's story, Sonia from Crime and Punishment. I don't know if you remember her, but she's a prostitute. And I felt Dostoevsky hasn't really given her a voice. And I wanted to do that. So I've written Sonia's story. Now we'll see what happens with that. But it's just another way to allow somebody who has not had the opportunity to speak, as my sister didn't, to give her the voice.
There's a quote here, I quoted in my book, but apropos of how, in a way, those of us who record memories, in a way, sort of kill them. Because memory, the analogy that I read that I love is that memory is not a thing. It's not stored like these books on a shelf. Memory is like comparable to the wind. When the wind is, it's a verb. When you remember, the wind is blowing, and you create the memory in the process of remembering, but it doesn't have an existence of its own until you write the thing down. Then you've given it this concrete form, and in a way you stop the wind from blowing. But this is the quote I wanted to read from Yadin Dudeh, who was with the Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel. He said, "The safest memories are the memories which are in the brains of people who cannot remember." Which I think says it very nicely.
Yes, and then I think of Dawn's last line. I think of her memoir, where she brings up, as we all did, I think, we start with the death and we end with the death. And she brings up this dictionary that her mother gives her. And the last line is something about all the words that we might have said or that we didn't. Am I right?
Yeah, it's all. Yes. A dictionary has all the words we might have said.
Yes, which is just wonderful. Yes, what's missing there?
Thank you. Yeah, I wrote a little preface when I wrote the book where I said all memoir is fiction, and to an extent, I believe that because you, as you said, you're taking these memories and you're forcing them into a different form, and you're essentially. You are changing them. Peter,
you're giving them form.
Yes, you're giving them form.
And they don't have it until you give it to them.
Now, you took it further. You said, if I mix a little fiction with nonfiction, a little lie with the truth, it's by way of making the truth even truer. You can't have the truth without lies.
Yeah, I got into a lot of trouble with someone about that who decided to sort of give me a hard time, and in a really nice, it was a sort of nice intellectual exchange, let's say, about that line. And she said, you should cut that line from the book. I said, why? Because I lose confidence in you as the narrator of this story. When I read that, I said, well, you're saying if I cut the line, suddenly you'll have confidence. And it's the paradox of the liar. The liar who says, I'm telling the truth. Or, don't listen to that person is a liar. And the liar says, yes, listen to that person, he's telling the truth. Right? And they cancel each other out. And I said, who's the bigger liar? The memoirist who says, I'm absolutely telling the truth, or the memoirist who says, well, yeah, duh. This thing called memory doesn't function without the imagination. It's impossible. You can't create narrative and then, worse yet, write it down as scenes with settings and dialogue or anything even remotely resembling those things without some sort of involving the creative, imaginative element.
Absolutely, and I actually have a scene in my memory, and I admit this in the book, that I don't remember if I saw this, and it's a very important scene. I don't remember if I saw this or my sister did, and that's the moment of my father's death. What I do remember is that the nurse who was there did not want this little girl, whoever it was, me or my sister, did not want her in the room seeing her father lying dead on the bed. That was considered, I suppose, too shocking for the child. And so the child is thrust out of the room. And in my memory, I don't know if I was the one who ran into my father's room and was thrust out and then ran back to tell my sister that my father had died, or if it was my sister who went in and came back and said, Daddy is dead. This before my mother came in to announce the event to us. So I think sometimes, particularly when you've written fiction where you write from different points of view, you don't know any longer who saw this. Who knew this? And I admit to that.
Sheila, one of the most haunting things about your book for me is that you wrote it first person. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that. And I even wondered if a little bit, if it in some way gave you a chance to spend more time with your sister.
Oh, you mean present tense?
Yes.
Yes.
I said first person. I
said
meant present tense.
Yes,
Thank you for knowing what I meant.
Yes.
Yeah, how
Obviously, you wrote it first person.
First person
Yes.
memoir. It's never been done.
Yes.
Yes. So perhaps, holding on to the moment, holding on to these few moments that we had together. But I have to admit that structurally, I have a forward movement in the book going from the death to the death. I announce the death at the beginning and then we get to how it happened. Which is, I think, exactly what you did, Peter, with your book, where you have the two, the father and the teacher, who are both the funeral of the father at the beginning and then the discovery that the teacher is dead, and then you take us through the book and you end with that. So I was doing that too. So I had a forward movement in the book, and then I had these flashbacks. Mm-hmm. So for the reader, sometimes that's confusing. So one easy way for the reader to know where they are is, if it's in the present tense or the past. So there was a kind of structural, practical reason to use and this is something I've done in fiction many times. In fact, I'm thinking Dawn once published a story of mine with a Red Book, which was called I think they called it, I had a more fancy name, I think I called it Quartet, and they published it as The Bride's Secret. Mm-hmm. Right? Which was wonderful, and I think I'd done exactly that with a sort of forward movement and then back flashbacks to kind of explain how she is, where she is.
And it's nice to have that as a sort of grounding anchor of the present tense, as a sort of. I'm reading a wonderful book, rereading, called The Nature of Narrative. Do you know Robert Scholes and Kellogg in the 60s? It's a whole history of narrative. And it's interesting to read that book, the perspective they give to the whole issue of what we do as memoir, because you know, in the olden days, going all the way back, you really had these two impulses, the empirical and the romantic. And romantic in the sense of idealizing life through the imagination, making up stories that perfected the world, and then the empirical meaning eyewitness and histories and Thucydides and reporting. And there was not this distinction between fiction and nonfiction. They were always sort of doing a dance together, you know, and so all these controversies about memoir, if you look at the larger picture of the history of narrative, there, it's just something in the continuum, you know,
and yet, I mean, I think what's very important is that there's some kind of emotional truth. I think when you read something, you can detect if it's honest or not. And it's almost in the prose itself, where one feels that something is phony in some way. There's something off there. So it doesn't mean that factually you got it all right and you remember everything that happened or one way or another. But your basic impulse is actually to be honest on the page.
There are the memoirs, I don't know if I want to cite any by name, or you read them and they just feel too much like the movie version, you know, like everything is happening in such a pat, perfect way for the camera. And then I become suspicious and feel like, oh, something, you know, maybe too much of the shaping of the imagination, and I don't know. But yeah, I think that, I don't think we should be making things up out of whole cloth, but I don't think we can help it. Our memories do it for us. They do it.
Yes, that's true. That's true. And certainly when you do a scene, you know, how much can you actually remember? And the precision of a scene remembered.
My students say to me, you know, I'm writing this, and how do I remember what so-and-so was like? I said, very simple, remember it. Just remember it, something will come, write it. That's called memory, that's how it works. You know, well, how do I know it's right? He said, you didn't ask me whether it had to be right, you asked me how do I remember it? You know.
See, I found like the objects were good things to hold on to, that they were a sort of a way to access the memories because they seem to contain so many in each one. And just that sometimes when I teach memoir, if I give people a little bit of a structure, it helps them find a way in to, you know, opening that door for themselves. But before I open this up, I just wanted to ask you what kinds of responses you got.
Oh, yes.
You know, once you put your life out there for people to judge. And
almost another book to be written there. You know, I had people who wrote and told me, I was talking about this earlier with a friend who actually knows the story. I had a letter from somebody who said, but we all knew that this was going on. And that was very shocking to me, that she was aware of this history of battering and the fact that this man was so dangerous. And that just took my breath away, because I thought, well, if everybody realized this was going to happen, why did no one stop it? And it made me feel better in a way, because I felt what I had written was perhaps true, but on the other hand, worse. And then I had another letter, who I was mentioning, from there's a lover in my book, who is not named and who is vaguely transformed. I think his blue eyes become brown or something like that. But anyway, his brother wrote to me and said, I want to give this to my brother as a present for his 80th birthday. He's turning 80. My goodness, that was a bit of a shock too, I have to say. So for his 80th birthday, I want to give him this present. And would you include a little note? And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm not sure that this 80-year-old man will want to see himself on the page. It wasn't unflattering, but there were certain things that I had said that maybe he wouldn't want the whole world to know. But anyway, I said, thank you so much for, you know, buying my book, and you could include with fond memories or something. So this is the kind of thing that
I know exactly the passage you're writing about. Yeah, I think he'd be okay with it. Yeah.
So,
I mean, for me, having worked on this book for a long time and it's finished, what I really, the most satisfying response is the artistic response when people say
Yes.
it's well done. I was hoping she would come with me tonight, but I had dinner with Vivian Gornick, and she liked the book a lot, and that was so satisfying to me because I consider her as sort of,
she knows what
she knows what she's talking about, and
Yes.
and she doesn't mince words.
Right,
that's
and
for
often
sure.
people don't respond to the actual book, the
Yeah.
writing of the book.
Yeah.
But there are people who, and I have had interviewers too. I had an English interviewer on the BBC who was extremely harsh, and extremely angry.
Yeah, he was nasty. What did he?
Extremely nasty.
Yeah.
He said, "This is all hearsay."
Oh,
And if you thought this had happened, why didn't you prosecute? Unfortunately, there was a woman on the show with me, and she came and she immediately tweeted afterwards, very harsh and critical interviewer. And they actually never aired it. So I don't know, but I felt, well, look, I've been through this experience. Why don't they put it on the, let them go ahead with it. Let him,
Yeah.
Let him hang himself in public.
Yeah.
Yes. Why don't we open up to questions? Yeah.
Yeah, just a question for Peter, but for everyone actually, about the rules or lack of rules about writing memoir as opposed to fiction. I was reminded of the quote from Isaac Singer. He said, "When I was a boy, they called me a liar, and when I was a man, they called me a writer." And the last time I was in this room, I had the privilege, so to speak, of hearing Peter read excerpts from a novel that he wrote about our friendship. As I deteriorated and crashed and burned and wound up in a mental institution, it was very graphic and very strange to follow that narrative, and it's my own life that I'm following it. My question for all of you is there an element of revenge in the work when the betrayals are so savage? And you're talking about murder, you're talking about the privilege of apartheid, you're talking about the betrayal of parents and families. Is there an element of payback?
That's a very good question. It's a good question. I think revenge, certainly in fiction, is good motive to use. And I actually wrote once this story as a fictional story called Crossways, where the sister, the remaining sister, actually runs over the brother-in-law who has, so that was certainly satisfying on the page, to be able to, although in life, obviously, it was not something that I felt would be possible.
Well, I would love to be able to sort of say from a lofty place that no, we never want to hurt anyone. I certainly didn't want revenge as a sort of conscious motive, but I also was very aware that the things I was saying about my father, obviously he had hidden this side of himself all these years, and I think so effectively that to himself it didn't even exist. And as far as my teacher, who I never name in the book, he certainly would not have wanted the fact that he had fabricated so much of himself to be exposed that way. Of course, they're both dead, but I would say that as a conscious motivation in writing memoir, anger and revenge are not very good. I think that you have, I always tell my students anyway, a better motivation is to understand, to want to know more. Even if you're writing about someone who was terrible, I want to understand. And that may get at the truth more, but in the process you're going to reveal that person, and if they were sons of bitches or real, bastards or whatever, you're going to give them the rope and they're going to hang themselves in front of everyone, and that's going to be it. But I think to write with that negative energy, I still love my father more than anyone. I never stopped thinking about how much I love my papa. And my teacher, I still love him, you know, and I never wrote as a victim. I wrote because I needed to write about these people who are so important to me. And so does it happen? Can it be a motive? Yeah, personally for me, it wasn't consciously.
Behind,
Yes, you both were talking about how you were liberated after these people died. And the situation I want to write about, the people are very much alive, and it wouldn't be too hard to figure out for the many people who knew about it what I'm talking about. But I don't want to wait for these people to die.
It's very unaccommodating of them.
So I'm seeing how the themes are interesting to me. So my question is, just from a very simple writerly question, how much would you have changed, let's say the teacher, would he become a college professor or somebody you knew when you were 7? You still wanted to write about it and he lived for another 20 years. How far would you have gone from his assassination?
Well, I don't think I could have written the book with, you know, I wasn't glad. I didn't feel liberated certainly when my father died, and I didn't feel any sort of, you know, liberation when I read my teacher's obituary or stumbled on it. But it did make it possible to write the book. It made it possible. You know, it gave me the missing pieces of the puzzle. And would I have written something else otherwise? Well, I tried for 25 years, and I did write other things, and they went into the trunk, so to speak. Do you know what I mean? I mean, they weren't successful.
And then you do have, I mean, I sat down actually for the first time, I've never done this before. My publisher, who is Penguin, made me sit down with a lawyer, and she went through it. And she, as Peter says, if anybody's dead, you can say anything. I mean, as far as the law is concerned, perhaps not as your conscience is concerned. But they made me go through this page by, and she said, is this person alive? And actually, the lover, I was not sure if he was alive or not. But anyway, apparently, let's hope he's not offended by anything I said. But,
that may do him in.
but she made me change. You know, you can make somebody's eyes blue and brown or whatever. But it's true that even if, I think he had, unusually for a South African, he was a big rugby player too, and usually he was a lover of opera. And he had these pictures of Tebaldi and Callas, who were the great stars of the time, up on his, and I didn't understand this at all. So in my book, though, I made it, you know, 2 other, I don't know, Stravinsky, and I had different musicians, you know. But it wasn't so satisfying, because in my mind I could see that picture of Tebaldi and Callas, and it's hard to change things, I think. You have to, if you have to, but yeah.
A question just occurred to me, Peter. I haven't read your book.
How dare you?
So I'm going to try to form the question. So you found out upon their deaths, not before, so that both of them were, quote unquote, living some sort of a lie. So that was probably why, I can't even remember if that was in the quote that Dawn just read, that you say in some way you are, that to tell the truth or telling lies, right? Is it the word lie that you say? Exactly the word lie in that quote? Because my question is, what are you trying to understand? Did you have questions all along while you were growing up that didn't seem to make sense? Because it's only when you discover they're dead that you find this whole...
Well, I did, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, there were things I didn't understand. I loved this man who was my teacher in 8th grade, and without giving too much away, our relationship was unusual. If that same relationship happened today, he would have been fired or arrested.
Okay.
It wasn't a sexual relationship, but it crossed many boundaries of intimacy with a 13-year-old boy and a man who was then 24 or 26, depending what source you rely on. But I was impassioned of this person, but I didn't quite understand that love. I didn't understand from his part, and it was confusing to me. And it was partly the confusion of a young man and all that stuff, but also because I think he was very confused, and he was very torn about his own feelings, and that he couldn't act on and be honest with himself about who he really was and what his needs were, you know, his erotic, his sexual, his romantic needs. He was a confused person, a lovely man in many ways, but he had issues, and he couldn't be honest about them. And so there were things I didn't understand about that relationship after it ended in a very strange way. And so I was seeking answers to that, and I was seeking answers to understand who my father was, because he was so distant. So there were things about these men I didn't understand.
So, and I'm kind of asking not even what you didn't, but the motivation, like, began way before then to want to tell the story. And
Yes.
But you waited until you didn't consciously wait, but you weren't thinking, I'm going to write memoir until.
Well, I was writing anything I could. I was writing about them. Yeah.
Right.
You know.
And maybe your question is a good one, because I think it's these secrets, these secrets that we probably all feel our parents have. We feel our mothers and our fathers didn't actually tell us everything.
Yeah.
Everything we'd like to know. And it's these secrets that drive us to the page in a way, because we want to find out, who are they?
And if they're the people who love you and you love them that much, and you know, and you want to know who these people are who are so important to you, in order to, in a way, to understand the value of that love, you know.
Of course,
Yeah.
what makes it so intriguing, of course, now I'd like to read it, is the fact that you found these such big lies about them after the fact, and how that when you go back and think of your own story and try to craft your own story, how that changes things. I don't know. I mean, it's intriguing.
Well, that's the question, and the answer is.
I think we have time for maybe two more, and then we should you're in the back.
Yes, I wanted to ask Sheila, how did the children react? You protected your parents.
Yes, thank you. Yes, well, I don't know how many of them have read the book, because, you know, I said I dedicated the book to them, but I also told them, you don't have to read the book. You know, I have a daughter who writes, and I said to her, I know, I am your source of material, so go for it.
Go for it.
And she did, you know.
Like you have a
so
choice.
I don't read the books, and she doesn't expect me to. So it's out there if they are ever interested, but they don't have to read it. I don't want to thrust my particular version of what happened in there. But much of what I've put in the book, they actually told me, you know. I didn't know that the father was beating the children, for example. They were the ones who told me afterwards that this was going on.
And your daughter has been all right with it?
Oh, and my daughter, I don't think she's read it.
Oh.
No. I don't think, one of my daughters has read it, and my grandson has read it. Because I happened to have left the galleys in the room, and he read it, and I said, oh gosh, you know, were you shocked? And he said, oh no, Gogo. They call me Gogo. Oh no, Gogo. It said, take much more than that to shock me.
People don't necessarily want to read that. And I even had it with my fiction. I had a friend of mine say to me, you know, I like knowing you the way I know you, and I don't want to know this other stuff. And I thought, well, that's really very, you know, but people will do that, and they will also interpret things in their own way. Very differently. Last question. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Sorry.
I was fascinated by your discussion of memory and what you remember. I'd like to know from each of you what you remember the most and what you remember the least. The way things look, the dialogue, the way you felt, the smells.
What a good question.
My memory is a silent movie. And yet I have to write the words.
Yes, I'm more of that kind of rememberer. I see the pictures
Yeah.
in front
How
of
do you
me.
get the words?
And I might get a line of dialogue, but not much. And that's the way I remember.
Yeah, but the
Yeah.
visual is very strong for me. I think dialogue is the hardest for me to remember.
Whereas for Dawn, I'm sure it's the words.
No, it's visual.
No, it
Visual.
is
Visual.
Well, you've got these
Yes.
objects, but I always feel for you the words are so important. The actual sentences are so important.
Yeah.
They are, but they're a translation of a
That's a
feeling.
great sentence to end on.
Yes, and there's a great quote by, now I can't remember her name, but she talks about memory, writing memory as a form of translation, or translating life.
So you might remember what somebody might have said because of their personality. or-
No, you remember the discussion, you remember what it was about, or speaking for myself, but you don't remember the actual lines of dialogue. I don't. But I know what the conversation was about, and I hear the characters' voices, I know how they spoke, and then you put it together, and, you know, I try not to do too much of that, but that's how I do it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reverend.